Disclaimer: this video is a historical documentary created for educational purposes. All scenes are artistic reenactments based on documented events. No real violence is shown or promoted. October 14th, 1066. On a bloody field in Sussex, the destiny of England is decided with the death of a king. The Battle of Hastings is over. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon monarch, lies dead, and a new era of Norman rule is about to begin. For most of us, this is where the story of the Norman Conquest usually ends. But for the loyal captains and commanders who fought beside Harold, the true horror wasn't always found in the heat of battle. It was in the cold, calculated terror of what came next. This is the story of the aftermath. It's a tale of rebellion, fierce resistance, and a brutal response designed not just to win a war, but to systematically break the will of a conquered people. It's a story that involves the horrific punishments of castration and blinding, not as random acts of violence, but as specific tools of a new political order. But was this really the fate reserved for Harold's captains? The answer is more complicated than you might think, and it reveals a much broader campaign of suppression that would change England forever. William, Duke of Normandy, might have won the battle, but he hadn't won the kingdom. Not even close. His coronation on Christmas Day, 1066, was a perfect sign of the chaos to come. Picture it. Inside Westminster Abbey, English and Norman nobles are proclaiming their new king. But the Norman guards outside mistake the roar of acclamation for a riot. In a panic, they set the surrounding buildings on fire. The ceremony had to be finished amidst smoke and terror, a fitting fiery start to a reign that would be defined by the sword. William's grip on his new kingdom was shaky at best. He controlled London and the southeast, but the rest of the country, especially the vast and fiercely independent north, was still defiant. The Anglo-Saxon military elite, though battered at Hastings, wasn't entirely broken. Powerful earls like Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria had survived, and while they initially bent the knee to William, their loyalty was paper-thin. They were a serious threat to the new king. So William had a problem. How do you control a resentful, rebellious population of nearly 2 million people with only a few thousand of your own men? His solution would be a three-pronged attack. Build castles, confiscate land, and unleash a campaign of terror so brutal it would be remembered for centuries. The first sparks of resistance caught fire in 1067 while William was away in Normandy. But the real challenge to Norman rule came from a source with powerful legitimacy: Harold Godwinson's own sons. Men believed to be his sons, Godwin, Edmund, and Magnus, had escaped to Ireland. They returned in 1068 and again in 1069, launching raids on the English coast with Irish mercenaries. They were the sons of a dead king, fighting to reclaim their father's kingdom. But their attacks failed to inspire a widespread uprising and were eventually beaten back. Their ultimate fates are lost to history, with some sources suggesting they fled to the court of the King of Denmark to seek more help. The greatest threat, however, came from the north. In 1069, a major uprising in Northumbria, backed by a massive Danish fleet, retook the city of York and slaughtered its Norman garrison. This was the moment of greatest danger for William. The rebellion was led by some of the last great figures of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, including men like Earl Morcar, who had clashed with Harold's brother Tostig before, and now saw one last chance to expel the invaders. This was the test. If the rebellion had been successful, it could have ended the Norman experiment in England right then and there. But William's response wasn't just to defeat them in battle. It was to make an example of them, to unleash a punishment so devastating that no one would dare rise against him again. The title of this video promises a story about castration and blinding. And yes, these horrific mutilations were a distinct feature of Norman justice, an import from the continent. In places like Normandy, blinding and castration were considered a fitting punishment for crimes like treason, a way to neutralize a threat without executing them. For a warrior elite whose entire identity was tied to their masculinity and ability to lead men, castration was a social death. Blinding served a similar purpose, making a commander useless on the battlefield. One of the so-called laws of William the Conqueror, written a generation later, even says, "I forbid that anyone shall be slain or hanged for any fault, but let his eyes be put out, and let him be castrated." While historians debate whether William ever said this, the practice itself is well documented. His own son, King Henry I, would later use it on rebels. It was a tool of state terror. But were Harold's specific captains systematically rounded up for this fate? Direct evidence for that is scarce. What we have is evidence of a broader and, honestly, far more terrifying policy. The Norman response to rebellion was collective and merciless, and this was most horrifically demonstrated after the Northern Uprising of 1069. What followed was an event that would scar the English psyche for generations: the harrying of the North. From the winter of 1069 into 1070, William's armies marched through Yorkshire and the North with a simple, brutal order: destroy everything. This wasn't just warfare, it was systematic annihilation. The Anglo-Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis described the horror years later. Villages were burned to the ground, livestock was slaughtered, food stores and crops were turned to ash. Some even say salt was plowed into the soil to make it barren for years to come. The human cost was catastrophic. Contemporary accounts speak of survivors reduced to eating horses, dogs, cats, and even each other to survive. Chroniclers claimed a death toll of over 100,000 people, most dying not from the sword, but from the famine and disease that followed. While that number might be an exaggeration, the Domesday Book, a massive survey compiled in 1086, tells a chillingly similar story. 17 years after the harrying, vast areas of Yorkshire were still recorded simply as waste. Some modern analyses of that data suggest the population of Yorkshire may have fallen by as much as 75%. On his deathbed, William himself is said to have confessed his guilt, admitting he had persecuted the native inhabitants of England beyond all reason. The harrying of the North broke the back of the resistance. What followed was the quiet, methodical dismantling of what was left of the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. This wasn't always done through execution, but through dispossession, imprisonment, and exile. So, what really happened to Harold's captains and the old English nobility? For most, the answer is simple: they were replaced. The Domesday Book of 1086 is a stark accounting of this transfer of power. Before 1066, England was controlled by several thousand Anglo-Saxon lords. By 1086, just 2 decades later, a mere 200 Norman barons held about half of all the land in England. The old landowning class was virtually erased. For those leaders who kept resisting, the end was often a prison cell. Earl Morcar, who later joined Hereward the Wake's famous rebellion in the Fens, eventually surrendered to William. Despite what seemed to be a promise of a pardon, he was thrown in prison in Normandy. He was briefly released on William's deathbed in 1087, only to be immediately re-imprisoned by William's son. He likely died in prison, a once great earl who simply vanishes from the historical record. Harold's own young son, Ulf, was captured and held as a hostage for nearly 20 years, only released when the conqueror lay dying. For thousands of other Anglo-Saxon warriors, the only option left was exile. Dispossessed and with no future in Norman England, they left to sell their swords abroad. A remarkable number of them found their way to the most unlikely of places: Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. There they joined the emperor's elite mercenary unit, the Varangian Guard. This legendary unit, once made up of Vikings and Rus, was transformed by the wave of Englishmen fleeing the Normans. By the late 11th century, the Guard was so dominated by them they were sometimes called the Englyn Barangoi, or Anglo-Varangians. In a final, bitter twist of irony, these exiled English warriors found themselves once again facing their old enemy. In 1081, at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, the Varangian Guard was deployed to fight against Norman invaders, led by Robert Guiscard, a relative of William the Conqueror. Thousands of miles from home, the last remnants of Harold Godwinson's army had their final, futile shot at revenge. The story of the Norman Conquest isn't just the story of a single battle. It's the story of a 20-year struggle for control, a struggle marked by brutal suppression and a revolution from the top down. The shocking image of castration and blinding, while a real and horrific part of the Norman arsenal, was just one tool in a much larger project. The true destruction of Harold Godwinson's captains and the Anglo-Saxon elite came from a relentless combination of terror, dispossession, imprisonment, and exile. The harrying of the North left a scar on the land that wouldn't heal for a century. The Domesday Book records the complete replacement of a native aristocracy with a foreign one, and the Anglo-Saxon exiles fighting in the Byzantine Empire tell a story of a warrior culture scattered to the winds. By the time William the Conqueror died in 1087, the old England of Harold Godwinson was gone. A new, harsher, and permanently changed nation had been forged in the fire of his conquest. The Norman Conquest is filled with these brutal and often forgotten stories. If you found this piece of history fascinating, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell for more. Let us know in the comments which part of the Norman aftermath you find the most shocking. Thanks for watching.